Okay, hello everyone. It's 9, at least in the Netherlands. I would like to start with this shared webinar of ISPAH and ISBNPA, live after your PhD, working in government health. I want to welcome you, first of all, on behalf of ISPAH and the NESI committee of ISBNPA. Together with Sophie Kompernol, I will host this webinar. And today we have two presenters. First of all, we have Associate Professor Luc Wolfenden. He's Associate Professor at the University of Newcastle, and his work is related about chronic disease prevention, and in his work he worked a lot with health services and health communities, and he also has a lot of experience with big health policy organizations, for example, the WHO or the UN Cochrane Center. He will give a better introduction himself, but for now, please welcome Luc. And afterwards, we have a great presentation of Nick Cavill. He is the director of Cavill Associates, which is an independent public health consultancy. And he's also a research associate of the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Before we start with the presentations, I will give a quick overview of the webinar system. First of all, I would like to ask you to mute your system, so you can do that with the microphone, so we are not disturbed by any noises. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. As soon as we finish the presentation, we will have a discussion together, and we can discuss all these questions that are popping up. Don't hesitate to already write your question in the Q&A. So at the end, we can collect questions. So the sooner you have your questions on board, the sooner we can also discuss them. If there's any problem with the Q&A function, please use the chat button. And please send your question to me or to one of the presenters, so we can also discuss them. And another thing is to raise your hand during the discussion if you want to interact verbally with one of the presenters. But first of all, I would like to ask you to share the Q&A so we don't have to disturb the presenters too much. Last but not least, I want to mention Karen Milton and her colleagues of ISPAH, also for co-organizing this webinar. For now, I will say let's start. We will meet in around 40 minutes to have a shared discussion. And I would like to ask Luc to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just get set up here. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present. I thought I might just start by telling you a little bit about myself, because that will, I guess, colour any advice that I might provide for new graduates or PhD students who are interested in a non-academic career. So I graduated from a psychology degree in 2002. So I was psychology trained, and I probably finished up in that degree knowing, quite well what I didn't want to do, and that is that I didn't want to do clinical practice. So I didn't want to actually practice as a psychologist seeing patients, because I found that a little bit too repetitive and too individually focused. And I had been exposed a little bit to academia, particularly through my honours and through some interaction with my supervisors, and academia wasn't particularly appealing to me either. I found it particularly, I guess, introspective and probably asking questions or just, generating new knowledge that sometimes I didn't feel had much applied value. What I did know is that I enjoyed working with people, and I had a strong service ethic. So I really wanted to be in a profession that was helping people and gave me a sense that I was, I guess, contributing to some greater good. So I applied for and was successful in getting a job at a local population health unit as a project officer. And in that role, I was required to develop health promotion programs and implement them in the community. And those health promotion programs target a range of kind of, the modifiable risk for chronic disease. And probably what I noticed when I worked in the health service was that my training as a psychologist, which was, I guess, quite, there's a lot of science in that degree. So you do a lot of statistics, you learn methods of evidence synthesis, and I found that that actually held me in quite good stead for a position of my role in that health service. So I found that I was, health promotion or public health is quite an eclectic field, and I found that having a grounding in science, at least at an undergraduate level, meant that I could, use evidence to help me with my work in that field. And I felt like I was probably a little bit better at doing that than other degrees or other people in the organisation from degrees that were probably less research focused or less from a scientific bent. And I think people, other colleagues that I worked with became aware of that, and the director of the organisation offered me an opportunity to do a PhD, which I decided to take up. And that PhD was in tobacco control, and I did a randomised controlled trial of an intervention in a hospital to try and get patients to quit smoking before they went into surgery. And that was because smoking cessation before you have an operation is good, because it might actually encourage you to quit smoking for good, but also has a number of material, tangible benefits to the health service. So people who quit smoking are less likely to be readmitted, have less surgical complications, and so on. So that kind of research question was particularly appealing to me, and the model of doing that PhD, which was very applied. It involved lots of interactions with the health service and the hospital, as well as the university. So it was a nice way of working. So I graduated in 2006, and I decided to take a year off, which I call the Year of Luke. So I went with my brother and travelled around the world for 14 months. And I did a little bit of work at that time. I managed a JAGA job at the UK Cochrane Centre, where I trained people, Cochrane authors, in how to do systematic reviews. But really that period of my life was an opportunity to reflect about what I wanted to do. And I had such a rich experience in my PhD that I guess I saw a lot of opportunities for building on the experience and the knowledge that I gained during my PhD, and using that to do health service work better. And so I returned after my PhD quite enthusiastic. I got a job as a health service manager within the same unit that I did my PhD. And then I went on to get a couple of research fellowships that provided me, independent funding to operate as an independent research fellow. And that was through the University of Newcastle. And while that gave me complete independence, I still decided to attach myself to the health service. So I wasn't being paid by the health service, but I sat in the health service and I worked closely with the organisation. And that was because it provided me with an opportunity to do integrated research and practice. I could use health service resources to collect data and to run interventions that were mutually beneficial. And so, it was good for me because I was conducting research that I thought had value, and it was good to the health service because the research that was being generated informed the decisions and the programs and the policies of that unit, so it could provide better service. And that experience led to a number of opportunities. Over time, it opened many doors, including with the WHO, where I was a visiting fellow, and a lot of consulting work with government and non-government organisations. And I think that's because this, this training as both a researcher and a practitioner, I think is still, quite novel. And organisations, and particularly government organisations, they like interacting people who can kind of bridge that divide between, research and policy and practice, and have a foot in both camps. I think at times they can be a little bit distrusting of academics, or can find them a little bit difficult to talk to. So I think that combined research practice experience has served me very well. And it's provided me with considerable employment diversity. So I feel, having gone through that experience, I would be, well qualified to continue to work either in government, health services, or as an academic. So that's been my experience so far. I think a career in health for people who have a PhD or are working towards a PhD, I think there are tremendous opportunities for a career in health organisations, and I think that's increasingly becoming the case. Government and non-government organisations are becoming increasingly accountable for the investments they make in the services that they provide. And so they need to make sure that what they're investing in works. And in order to do that, there needs to be a degree of scientific literacy within the organisation. So they need to make sure that they're developing their programs or policies based on some consideration of research and science, to give them the best chance that their program or policy has a beneficial impact to the community. And at least in Australia, I'm not sure what the context is in other countries, but research funds are now being awarded to health services rather than academic institutions. And that's because the government who funds the research is wanting to make sure that the research that's conducted actually has applied value and is going to contribute to improvements in community health and well-being, because that's really what government investment in research is intended to do. And so government services in Australia will soon have access to funds to conduct research. And so the value that's placed in a scientific skill set for employees is increasingly high, because they want to leverage that funds in order to improve the services that they provide. So I think there's a growing opportunity for the skill set that PhDs bestow in government and non-government organisations, and I think it's going to be more the case. And that's reflected. I just did a quick Google of some position descriptions for government organisations in Australia. So this is for the New South Wales government, the description of a policy officer, and I guess I've highlighted each of the accountabilities that you probably, as someone graduating with a PhD, feel quite comfortable in being able to undertake. Your PhD should really put you in a good position to be able to do those sorts of accountabilities. So, this is not just the case for policy roles, in practitioner roles as well. Our organisation has a position description which looks a little bit similar to this, but one of the desirable criteria is actually having a PhD. So what does a PhD prepare you for? So I think all PhDs should really do three things. They should teach you a way of thinking, the scientific method, to be critical, methodical, systematic in how you approach issues and think through problems. And I think this way of thinking is probably the most valuable and generalizable skill that you develop as part of a PhD, and probably is the thing which is of most value to government and non-government organisations. Because probably no other degree teaches you, prepares you or teaches you how to think or operate like this. It also gives you the capacity to apply science to solve problems, which has clear, benefits for organisations. So you can conduct studies, you can access, interpret, and use evidence. And it also provides very technical skills. So you can actually conduct data analysis, you can do scientific presentations, and you can write scientific manuscripts. And those technical skills are useful, and particularly useful for academia. Less useful, still valuable, but less valuable to other outside organisations. However, a PhD, particularly if you're doing an applied PhD, may provide you with a range of other skills, which I would argue would increase the likelihood or your preparedness for employment in non-academic careers. So a good applied PhD will also provide you with opportunities for leadership, within your specific project or on your specific project, but also broader than that. So within the structures of your university or within the professional societies or other institutions for which you collaborate. It can provide you with opportunities to build teams and collaborate. I think PhDs, or the demands of PhDs, now are requiring a more versatile communication style. So it's not just report writing and academic presentations, but you need to be well versed in how to communicate with the media and how to engage other key stakeholders in your research. It can expose you to good project management and governance and to non-academic industries. And I think that kind of exposure is really valuable when you go to apply for a position in a non-academic industry or organisation. Excuse me for a sec. So my experience of working in government, but also working with government and non-government organisations is there's different kind of positions require people with different sorts of skills. And I think when you graduate with a PhD, if you're looking for non-academic work, I think there's three main roles or types of roles that you might end up in. One is working in a policy unit with government. Another is working as an advocate, a community advocate for a non-government organisation. And the third is working as a practitioner. This could be either in a non-government or government organisation. So I haven't worked in a policy unit, but I have worked with them. And my experience has been that in government policy, the people who work in this industry are very professional and very efficient. So the demands of working in a policy unit mean that you need to do things very quickly and that you need to be highly flexible. So I have colleagues working in policy who are doing different things on different days across different topics, working with different people. And they provide information and evidence to guide policy up through the hierarchy very quickly. They value evidence. So I've used the word evidence informed here, but they're not evidence zealots. So they see evidence as one piece of useful information to guide policy, of which there are a number of other important factors to consider. They have strong and diverse communication skills, and because they need to be everything to everyone, they have they're very good at engaging and working with a range of stakeholders. In the NGO sector, as an advocate, I guess I characterise that environment as less frantic as a government policy office, and probably more opportunistic. So it's a little bit slower paced and not in fifth gear all the time, but they're highly opportunistic. So when the policy door is open or when the political cycle is ready, non-government organisations mobilise quickly and advocate for a position that serves their agenda, or the agenda that they're responsible for. They, like policy officers, are evidence informed, so they value evidence, but they understand that there are a variety of other factors that go into good government policy, and so they also use other levers. They have very strong and diverse communication skills, and they have the capacity to form coalitions. So they need to mobilise groups to get behind their position in order to apply pressure to government or other industries to get a policy outcome. And finally, there's practice organisations. And what I mean by practice organisations is the organisations or the services that actually deliver. They don't make the policy, they deliver on the policy or deliver the services that stem from government policy or government investment. So this could be, allied health positions, or it could be population health units like the one I work in, where they develop programs and deliver them to the community. These are less frantic and less idiosyncratic. than policy or government positions. So they're not as quick. There's more time to plan and deliver, but their positions within these organisations are quite diverse. So often in practice organisations, you can have a large team, and different people in the team have different roles in that institution or that organisation. And there are different and more layers of management. So there are different opportunities for career progression, and there's probably more opportunity for employment in these kind of practice organisations. Again, they're evidence informed, and they also require a capacity to engage and work with stakeholders. So what employers don't want is they don't want self-righteous evidence zealots. And I think academics can have, a bit of a bad reputation in policy and practice circles as, people who come from, from an ivory tower, who come across and tell policy and practice organisations that they're doing things wrong, that what they're doing isn't evidence-based, or that there's insufficient evidence to justify, the investments that they're making. And that really puts policy or practitioners on the back foot, and probably if you're working in policy or practice organisations, I think you quickly realise that, evidence, you don't need, often you need to act in the absence of, meta-analysis of 30 or 40 randomised controlled trials on an issue. The community and your constituents require action on emerging health threats, and often that needs to occur in the absence of evidence. And if you are waiting around for enough evidence to come forward, then things will get worse over the 20 years while you're waiting for that evidence to accumulate. And so the academics who are blinkered and only invested in evidence to solve solutions, to solve problems, are often not thought of well by policymakers and practitioners. You also need to understand that policymakers and practitioners operate within a different framework. They have less independence. There are more checks and balances, and they're not sole traders. They work in a bureaucracy, and so they have to manage the bureaucracy in the institution in order to come up with a policy option or a service that best meets the needs of the community. And so they don't have the freedom that academics do in terms of saying what should happen. They actually are responsible for making it happen. And they often can't do that. Often that takes time, and they need to make sure that they bring people along with them. And so there's a specific way that they need to operate in order to achieve that. I think there's probably limited space for technicians or content experts in health service positions. So if you've done your PhD on, establishing cut points for an accelerometer, that's a great and useful academic question that would make an important contribution to science, but that has very little value for a policymaker or a policy or practice organisation. Similarly, most of these organisations don't want someone who'll only talk or has only expertise in nutrition or physical activity or obesity and is not prepared to move. Most of these organisations require flexibility. They're dynamic organisations, and what they really want is to apply your underlying skills and capacity to work across areas as it's required. And so the more flexible that you can be, and the more you can generalise your skills, I think the more successful you'll be in policy and practice organisations. They don't want people who don't have the capacity to work within a bureaucracy. So bureaucracies have processes, procedures, forms, and have a politics that is unique to those organisations and can frustrate people from academia, or can frustrate everyone, including people who are working within these organisations. And we've certainly had a number of academics come to my organisation that haven't lasted a long time just because they get too frustrated with the constraints of bureaucracy, and that they've gone back into academia, which is fine, but it's certainly something that you need to understand, and probably it's a bit easier to deal with if you know, once you get an understanding of the purpose of these processes, procedures, and so on, so why they exist in the first place. And there's often very good reasons. But certainly it's not as, it can be seen as less efficient from that perspective than other organisations like universities where this is less the case. And they don't want sole traders, so they want people who can integrate into large teams and work you know, of course work unsupervised, but also work with and across teams. So where to start if you're interested in a health service or policy position? I think you probably have to give some thought about what career do you want? Is it in research, is it in teaching, or is it in government or industry? You need to develop a plan to get there. My advice is it's good to have a long-term vision or plan, but your focus should really be on planning for the short term. By planning for the short term, I mean, you know, that could mean what am I going to do this week? But, you know, what am I going to achieve over the next, you know, 3 to 6 months? And I think if you focus on those short-term plans, then you move a lot quicker. But also it gives you if you're not fixated by the long-term goal, it gives you the capacity to be opportunistic and, you know, make the most of opportunities to move into areas that maybe you didn't think you were going to move into based on your long-term vision, but which might be better suited to you. You need to make sure that your plan is feasible and that you've got some way of monitoring your performance against your own plan. So a mentor is often a really good opportunity, a really good way to do this. So we will typically have performance development and reviews with a mentor or a line manager, and you know that mentor or line manager will work with you through each of your goals and your action plan to move towards the career that you want to. And so you'll need to report to them, you know, each quarter about how you're going, and that also holds you accountable for making sure you progress. So a plan is, of course, a good idea. Other ways in which you can set yourself up for employment outside academia is ideally you want to be doing a PhD or a postdoc on a topic that is diverse and has some policy or practice relevance. So the more that you can develop those, I guess, soft skills that I mentioned a couple of slides earlier about engaging, about, you know, the more likely that you will be able to meet the criteria of position descriptions in those organisations. You need to hunt for opportunities to develop non-academic skills, and you need to work with people doing policy or practice relevant research. So it would be great if you have a supervisor who's doing this kind of research, who has good networks outside of academia into industry and government. And work with them as much as you can, because when you're working on their projects, you'll also be introduced into their networks. You'll meet people, and if people are impressed by you, it doesn't matter what institution they work for, you know, they'll want to work with you, and they'll have a favourable view of you if you ever apply for a job. You should be looking to engage government and non-government organisations in your research. In Australia, at least, there are organisations that provide opportunities for you to act as consultants. So governments or non-government organisations will provide opportunities for academics to write systematic reviews on a policy or practice relevant issue that they need evidence synthesis for. And that's actually a really good way of getting an academic return. So you're getting a publication because you're doing a review, but also you're meeting with often senior level policymakers or practitioners. And that's a really good way to form a relationship with these people and also understand a little bit more about how they work and what sort of information that they're after. And that's a good way of particularly for early career researchers, to get your foot in the door and start to form relationships with these organisations. You need to network with these individuals, so make yourself known, and of course you can volunteer. I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Luke. That was a very interesting presentation. I think we will continue to the next presentation and then just get all the questions together at the end. So we will have a session then also with Nick. Thank you again, Luke, and I see you after the presentation of Nick. For those who just tuned in, welcome at the shared webinar of ISPAH and the NESI committee of ISBNPA of Life After PhD, work in government, health and society. We just had a very nice presentation by Luke, and we will now continue by presentation of Nick Cavill. He's a director of an independent public health consultancy and also a research associate of the University of Oxford. I think Nick will give a more broader introduction of himself. Looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Can you hear and see me okay?
I do.
Cool.
So I think
let's hope everyone else can. I'm so glad, Luke, that you went first because you've given a much more rounded and balanced and considered answer to the question. Mine is a more rambling life history, but because, and I'm going to put up my blurb next, because as my blurb says, I've worked in quite a few different places. I just thought if I explain some of the weird government agencies and departments I've worked in and some of the good and bad points about them, that would provide some illustration, and I think maybe they'll illustrate Luke's points. So I'm leaving this up because it's a hideously boring slide, but first learning point post-PhD is you need a blurb. Everyone needs a blurb. When you go to speak at a conference, they'll say, where's your blurb, or where's your personal statement, or whatever. And as you can see from this load of rubbish written on the screen here, you cram as much as possible into one long paragraph to say how wonderful you are. But basically, this tries to describe the range of different places I've worked. So I am going to address the main topic, which is working in government agencies. But I think it's quite interesting to sort of start now and then look back. So just to briefly explain that, we did how I got to where I am. So I've just put up a screenshot of my website, or my company's website. And I've had an unusual and I think, quite interesting career path. And people sometimes say, well, how could I emulate your career path, or how can I? It's probably not possible because I've had a lot of coincidences and lucky breaks, if you like. But I'm going to try to illustrate some of those. So I now run my own company called Cavill Associates Limited. We have associates who work with me. I don't have any employees, and so the secret is actually it's just me. It's just me employed by this company, working on all these issues, but I link to associates when I want to go for larger tenders. And I think for people doing their PhD right now, looking for a career in public health, you may want to think about this in the future, but it's really quite an unusual step for someone just finishing a PhD because it takes time. So with all these things, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. So the advantages of working for yourself is absolute autonomy. I can choose whatever work I want to do. I can refuse contracts if I don't want to feed my children. And I can turn down work, and so on. So you have absolute autonomy. I can work as many or as few days or hours as I wish, and please myself. The downside, of course, is if I do that too much, I won't eat. And so with all this, with private consultancy, there's a balance all the time. Sometimes you have to choose projects or choose contracts that aren't very lucrative. Sometimes you have to choose contracts that aren't very interesting. And sometimes you're lucky and something is both lucrative and interesting. And often I work in this sort of quasi-academic position. I have academic associations with a couple of universities, and I publish papers and so on, but I'm basically a businessman. So in this quasi-academic situation, you also have to do free things. No one pays me to go to a conference, or very few people do, and no one ever pays you to write papers. So it's a big balance. But I would say, let's not think about the relatively small and targeted area of self-employment or private consultancy. because it has the big advantage of autonomy. And as you'll see throughout the examples I give, that's very important to me. So I've worked for all these different agencies, and I'm just going to try and quickly take you through each one and just give you a little glimpse about what they were, what type of organisations they were, how I worked for them, because in some cases I was employed, sometimes I was just fulfilling a contract. But more interestingly, the pros and cons and some of the things about the culture of these types of organisations. So first of all, the Health Education Authority. So this is where I started, and I was lucky enough basically to secure a national position working for the Health Education Authority, which was what they called at the time a quango, a quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation. So as the name implies, some autonomy, but attached to government. And I really genuinely was extremely lucky to have got to a middle management position when the UK government realised physical activity was a big problem, piled lots of money into it and asked us to launch a social media, or we didn't even call it social media then, a multimedia campaign. So we ran this big campaign with adverts and press coverage and public relations activity, with TV advertising, with poster campaigns, promoting cycling, walking and gardening, and then we had commercial activity, linking up with commercial agencies, and the big money went on to a TV advertising campaign. Not all good. Some of the downsides of working in the public eye, you know, in quite a high profile position, was this sort of thing, which I laugh about now, all these very negative press coverage. This exercise is pointless, they said when we launched our new campaign. And just down here, I noticed you can actually just see my name as the spokesman here. The press, the good old British press, lampooning our efforts to change couch potato culture. Just looking back, for me, this was a fantastic place to work, an absolutely amazing opportunity. And why is that more interesting for you? So the organisation was quite autonomous. The government, Department of Health, signed a cheque and provided a brief, if you like. You know, we want you to launch a big campaign to get the nation moving. But the Health Education Authority had a high degree of autonomy to decide, based on evidence, the way ahead, the way this should be done. And for my mind, that's extremely important. And in my opinion, that gives me a lot of job satisfaction. A second thing that was really good about this was because it was a national health agency, and it dabbled in public relations and marketing and advertising and research and evidence collation. It meant that people working there met the best in a range of different disciplines. So in the few years of the campaign, you know, I was learning about the advertising industry because I was running an advertising campaign. I was learning about public relations because I had to manage a £150,000 public relations contract. I was learning about research, and that's when I first met Professor Adrian Bauman and people like that. So to be able to, one of the big advantages of working for a national agency is that you can learn from you know, some of the best minds in the business and a range of different businesses. It wasn't just you know, physical activity academics. For each one, I'm trying to think about the downsides, and you know, looking back, I can't see many downsides. The main downside was that we were closed down. The government perhaps thought we had too much autonomy and closed down the Health Education Authority and dispersed the responsibilities. Next one to think about, I then worked for the Department of Transport. Initially to work on this campaign because of my campaigning, you know, sort of media campaigning experience, to work on this, which was an environment campaign. Are you doing your bit? Covered energy saving, water saving, and also, in my case, transport, you know, walking, cycling instead. So I was seconded from the Health Education Authority to work on this campaign. And this was a real shock. And some of the things that Luke said about government departments resonated with me. The culture was so alien, so different from the previous place I'd worked. In government departments, certainly in the UK, and from what I've seen in other countries such as Australia from a distance, incredibly strict and rigid and disciplined ways of working. Very strict hierarchies, probably softer now. This was 15 years ago. So for instance, I would say, I was thinking of setting up a meeting with so-and-so, and the person I'm talking to would say, oh, what grade is he? You can only invite someone at the same grade. You can't invite a grade 5 to meet a grade 7. You'd have to get the parallel grade 7. And I found all that horrible. And I even remember someone saying, describing a person as, you know Fred, he's the one with red hair, grade 7. You know, as if that describes someone. And so I was sort of shocked by the hierarchy, the strict and disciplined and rather controlled ways of working. But again, I really enjoyed working with skilled people, and particularly in this case, it was more about the media and marketing and communications teams, who in government are generally excellent because that's their business, you know, promoting and communicating the work of government. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting and would be interesting to you guys was the relative lack of respect for research that I saw in that government department at that time. If the policy was going through, it was going through no matter what, and I didn't see a great deal of evidence being used to justify policies in that situation. Rattling forward, because we must keep some time for question, the Department of Health I worked at in the main UK Department of Health, so again a government department, and the culture here was quite different. So in the same city and under the same government with the same ministers, and yet the working culture in the Department of Health was really very different from the Department of Transport. A much stronger and greater respect for evidence. And maybe that comes from the public health learning rather than, or the public health discipline rather than transport people. And here are some examples of a couple of things we've worked on, you know, big reviews of the evidence to produce physical activity guidelines. And they were based, you know, very solidly on the evidence base. And so that was rewarding to use scientific skills to help to create policies. But I still found it mattered, the respect for evidence was used when appropriate. And here's an example, I won't bore you with the details, but an example when findings were ignored and some findings that fitted with the minister's policy were promoted and findings that didn't fit were ignored. And so I think any, again, related to what Luke said, any evidence zealot or anyone who is, you know, focused only on the strict linear path from evidence into practice will be sorely disappointed and frustrated by working directly in government departments, I think. A couple more just interesting examples, I hope. I haven't worked for the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, NICE, but I've worked with them a lot, so I've been on tons of committees to do with NICE, and I ran a NICE collaborating centre. And here's a really interesting organisation. You would think it would be boring to work there. All they do is create guidelines. Very strict and disciplined and controlled and guideline-based process. So the manual is this thick. Can you see this thick? To tell NICE employees how to produce guidelines. And they follow a very linear path from forming a committee and reviewing the evidence. But the people who work there absolutely love it and find it very stimulating. And I think that's probably related to a couple of points I've already made. Very solid use of evidence and seeing that evidence into practice and working with some of the best people in every topic. So, you know, I've just put some examples of physical activity guidance on here. These would have been written by the best people in the country or maybe even Europe who were flattered, frankly, to be asked to be on a NICE committee. So those sorts of evidence-based guidelines, I guess what I'm trying to say is if somewhere looks like a boring place to work, check it out, it might not be. A couple more to go, I think, before questions. I then worked for the National Obesity Observatory. And this was a really interesting experience. So again, I think the name sounds pretty dull, doesn't it? Observatory, you know, what you're doing, watching overweight people and counting them. And as the description here says, single point of contact. So it was about information and data. But this was an extremely rewarding place to work. And again, it's about autonomy. So this was invented by a colleague, Harry Rutter, who was talking to the Department of Health and said, what we need is a sole single point of information, somewhere that's really evidence-based and brings together all the evidence about obesity. And luckily, he said that to the right person, and that person said, okay, then go and set it up. And Harry formed a team and produced a solid, or led a solid approach to collating the evidence on obesity with almost a blank slate. The Department of Health would say, more or less, tell us some interesting stuff about obesity, and we would go off and we would decide what were the most important issues to review, what were the most important fact sheets to produce, and so on. And so for the few years that we were allowed to look after ourselves, this was very rewarding because we felt as if we had control over the process and the information. And also one other interesting thing about this organisation was it was dispersed geographically. There was a central office, but not many people worked there. Most of us were scattered around the place. And through intelligent use of teleconferences and regular meetings and good systems, it worked absolutely fine. We did not all have to be in London or in a central place. Final one, I think, yeah, final one, Public Health England. So NEW, the National Obesity Observatory, again, it's about autonomy. I think the government spotted NEW as being a little bit uncontrollable, and the particular government that came in wanted to get more of a grip on information, and so NEW was absorbed into Public Health England. And my experience here was less positive. Public Health England is the main public health body agency for England, as the name implies, and so any academic or post-PhD person thinking of wanting an evidence-based career in public health would do very well to consider somewhere like Public Health England, because it's the national agency, and what it gives is this rewarding feeling of influencing policy, being close to government and ministers, and doing things that are important. But I've always said, people have often asked me if they should apply for a job there, and I think the downside are the ways of working. It can be chaotic, and I think that's one thing that I would say about all the government departments I've worked in. Without exception, I would travel in each day, usually on the bike, and on the way in, like I'm sure everyone does, I think, what will I do today? And I plan my day, and by 9:05, that plan was always absolutely out of the window. And that's because these places work on 1,000 miles an hour. Ministers want information like this, and you are out of control of your own agenda. And so, as I think I've mentioned, this is a final slide. What I think, just thinking about this today, and planning this talk, these are the factors that I think all my different experiences of government-type departments have sort of thrown up for me. The first is professional autonomy, and by that I mean the ability to decide on one's own career path and the projects and programs and work and methods that we can work on. I guess the older you get, probably the more important that is to you. But for me, that's a key element of any working in any organisation. And I think anyone wanting to go into a non-academic career would need to think, how much professional autonomy do I have? How much can I influence my working agenda? Second is influence, and I guess that sort of links to the third point. It feels nice to think, oh, I made a difference. I influenced that minister. I'm working in London. I'm going to the Department of Health in Whitehall, or I'm going to the House of Parliament to make a presentation. It feels cool, and that gives you some self-reward. If that's important to you, and for some people it may not be. I think the next point, which again Luke mentioned in many cases, how much does that organisation have a respect for science? I think it's clear that if you look at somewhere like, in my experience, NICE, they're obsessed with and based around scientific evidence, and if you look at some of the government departments, they will frankly use evidence to push. They'll cherry pick the evidence to support the policy. Obviously, job security is an important issue for many people. I have almost no job security as a self-employed person, but I have enough confidence from my past to not worry too much about that. Someone working in a government department will have high job security. And the final one is personal autonomy. You know, how much, the extent to which you can control your own working day, take time off when you want to go, in my case, go cycling when the weather's nice and so on. You know, these are things we might want to consider when considering a job if we have the luxury to do so. So I think I better stop because we've only got 10 minutes left. I hope that gives you a flavour of my strange career and some food for thought.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was very nice to hear and also very nice examples. Luke, maybe you also would like to get back to us so we can start the discussion with both of you. Well, I have some questions, but first of all, we have 2 questions from attendees. First of all, from Borja del Pozo Cruz, apologizing if I pronounce your name not as how it should be. She's been working in academia for the past 7 years, and she's still doing applied research, but would like to end up informing policies and testing policies at the government level. She can't find any formal pathway for this idea, so she's wondering how can she work towards this professorship. Does she need to stay in research, or is it advisable to work part-time as a consultancy? Do you have any suggestions how to get into this field of research?
Should I try first, Luke?
Go, please.
Yes, so I don't think there is a formal pathway. In fact, well, I'm pretty sure there isn't one in the UK. I don't know about other places. And so it has to be informal situations. And I guess that comes down to things like secondments. That can be a pretty cool way to, and I don't know if you, does everyone know what that word means? You know, so
sorry, what is it? Yeah.
Secondment. So you are in your existing job and you're paid by your existing employer, but they send you to a place for 6 months to, not just as work experience because you're contributing, but you then go back to your existing job. So it's to enrich your career, but you're still receiving payment from your existing employer. That's one. You know, internships, that is obviously possible, voluntary work, or of course, go for it and apply for a job and see what it's like. But I don't think I know of many you know, formal training pathways.
Thank you.
Yeah, in Australia, there's a couple of training pathways. So there's New South Wales government offers trainee programs where people are placed across a variety of policy and practice organisations over a period of 2 years. And the idea is that you're literally trying to train the next generation of, you know, policy and practice leaders. And that training program comes with I think it's a master's of, it's not a master's of public health, but it's a master's level degree. I guess so I appreciate that's not likely to be the case in other jurisdictions or other countries. I guess the other advice I'd provide is, I guess if you're wanting to work, wherever you want to work, you should look to, I guess, work with them or work with that organisation through the position that you're currently in, if that's possible. So that could be via consulting. So it might be that you could pick up bits of private work and act as a private consultant with that organisation, you know, writing systematic reviews or synthesising evidence. Or
get on a committee.
Or join a committee, exactly. Yep. The other option, I guess, is to volunteer, which you probably don't want to do if you're, you know, a number of years out and you don't really have the flexibility to be giving up days. But I think personal relationships, you know, getting to know the people in the organisations that you want to work with is probably have most of these doors open. If you've got if you're looking for a non-traditional entry into a position, then you really have to leverage the relationships that you have within that organisation. And I think if you've got a good relationship and you're trusted, then doors open for you. It's just about trying to work out how you can get to know and work and be trusted by individuals within that industry.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. Thank you so much. If we would have more time, I would continue asking about this topic, but we have 2 other questions. First of all, Jacqueline Meyer. She has a question if it's very difficult, or did you work with a person who was very difficult or which was unproductive? So potential person who is at the higher level of you in government health, and how did you deal with that?
Oh, well, when I was preparing... Should we go
on private conversation?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so one of the organizations, and you may be able to guess which one because I said I didn't enjoy it. Yeah, I had a couple of bosses who were very difficult to work with, and that shocked me actually, and I found it a very stressful situation. It made a big difference to working relations, because in our business, most people are nice, aren't they? You know, we're not cutthroat business people. We're not interested in the bottom line generally. Most people work together, and so yeah, I have come across. I've had some difficult situations, and I don't know how I dealt with it. Just the normal way, I guess, of either balancing, putting your head down and getting on with it, or challenging that person. But it's probably the same in any workplace.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Luke, do you have any additional comments?
Only, I mean, I think, you know, regardless of the organisation that you're working with, it could be in your own university, you really want to disinvest in those professional relationships that aren't working for you, you know, that you don't enjoy. So, you know, I think you should look for opportunities to disinvest in those relationships. I think you're better served by working with people that you enjoy working with, rather than
totally.
Working with people you don't just for an opportunity, because it's probably an opportunity you don't want anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, thank you. I have another question from Wendy van Lippenvelde. Nick, she has a question for you. How did you take the step to start your own company? And were you sure enough of beginning? Did you have enough clients? Or did you have a feeling of having enough experience? So
yeah. Okay,
how
so
did it happen?
for me, I think it was an easy decision. My organisation was closed down. I got redundancy. I didn't have another job to go to, but I was offered this secondment, so, you know, like a paid position almost, at the Department of Transport, and then also some time at the Department of Health, because, as you said just now, I'd worked with them, and I guess they'd said, oh, he might be useful. And then I'd got some ideas for other work too. And so I remember I went for counselling, career counselling. And at the end of the session, the woman said, so let me get this right. You want to be self-employed, and you've got at least 5 days work a week, and you've told them your day rate and they've agreed to it. Why have you come for counselling? Just get on with it, you know. And so I was lucky. I was in a lucky position because of the experience I'd had before. Quite a few people over the years have set up as independent consultants, friends and colleagues, and some haven't made it. And usually the problems they have is you're basically not having enough work, and so not keeping the money coming in, but also not feeling confident enough to take the risk, and to worry too much about having gaps between work. And so obviously that depends about, you know, how much income you need and whether your partner's working and all those personal things. So it is a delicate balance of confidence and bravado, but also knowing what you've got coming in. And I would say, you know, I feel for people who want to do it now, because the climate, the economy is not supportive of people who want to set up on their own and take those risks. You know, I emphasize I was lucky to have done it early enough that I built up the contacts and, you know, just about keep going.
Okay. We have 2 more questions left. We're a bit running out of time, so I'm not sure if we are allowed to continue, but Luke and Nick, are you okay to answer 2 more final questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have a question of Michael Owen. He has a question, especially to you, Nick, but I think it's also like worldwide, or well, at least as well in the Netherlands, a problem that the majority of the government or public health jobs seems to be located in the south of England, mainly in London, so mainly in like the big cities. is this also your experience? And maybe also Luke, you experienced this as well in Australia. And what would you recommend to someone looking to get into public health, or would you also recommend government agencies at the local level, maybe also outside the big cities?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, so that's the issue, is that unfortunately most of the big jobs are still central. There is decentralisation happening. For example, the Department in England, Department of Health, one big section of it moved to Leeds, which is 300 kilometres north of London. But of course, there are these regional or local government offices, and they are full of great people, and often the same calibre people as would work in London, but they've got the extra brains to know that working in the capital city is maybe not the best thing to do, and they get out of there. So yeah, and that's what we did. I'm now based 300 kilometres north of London, and travel there when I need to. And so yeah, I would say look around and don't think you have to go to the capital.
You don't think it's not beneficial, not like being located near London? Does it struggle?
Yeah, well, I spoke to a consultant the other day who lives in a ski resort in the French Alps, and I said, how do you manage? And she said, I just manage. I keep the work going. I love living here. And so I travel when I need to and turn down things when I don't need to. So it's that balance. I was so jealous because I really want to do that. But so it's a balance, and it's certainly, there are many advantages in saying to people, okay, let's meet. And it's only a, €10 train fare in half an hour, compared to, oh, well, I'm not coming down for another 3 weeks and can we have a video conference? It does help to be able to meet people, but it's not the end.
Cool, thank you. Luke, just because of the time, I think I will ask the final question to you. From Puya Sadi, apologies again for not pronouncing your name very well. When you're just finishing your PhD and you want to work, for example, in government health, what is the best way to approach the organization or the government, or should you go for like a job application or just write an open letter of interest? What is your experience or suggestion on this, Luke?
I guess you'll have, you may well be successful, but you'll have the least chance of success if you just go in cold like any other applicant. I think it's best, as I mentioned before, to see if you can form a relationship. So I think emailing the organisation just to see whether you can do a placement there, or to express an interest to send their CV, doing that multiple times. So don't just do it once. If an employer knows that you're super keen to work there, then I think that's half that's an incredibly desirable attribute for an applicant, that they'll do anything to work for your organisation. So I think that you want multiple different strategies to engage that organisation, and doing that in advance of a job application, I think, would enhance the likely success of your application for work there. So as I mentioned, that could be on committees, that could be doing pro bono work, that could be volunteering, that could be just expressing an interest, seeing them at conferences and doing personal introductions. Yeah, so I think you want a variety of strategies.
Cool, thank you so much. Well, as we're already exceeding our time, Nick and Luke, on behalf of ISPAH and ISBNPA, I really would like to thank you for your nice contribution. I think it was a nice combination of providing your own experiences working in government health or working with them, but also give a nice overview of what they're looking for, what the possibilities are. So I think it was very helpful for us academics, early career and PhD students. Maybe if there are some other questions, I saw them, we're not able anymore to answer them, but if you have a very, very urgent question to Luke or to Nick, I think don't hesitate to email them directly and ask the question. For now, I would like to end this webinar. For those of you in Australia, I hope you have a good work day. So Luke, good luck. And for us in Europe, we can go to bed. So Nick, good night.
Yeah, good night.
And finally, I would like to thank also Antonio and Georgia for the technical support in this webinar. And I hope to see you next time on this NESI webinar as well. And please follow our NESI newsletters, so we will announce new webinars on nice topics. For now, thank you everybody, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.